So in the first video, Catherine's already explained a little bit about this gravestone, and in it she described the text and the picture. And having a picture on a gravestone is not something that we see very often today. So Catherine, why do we see pictures on gravestones like this in the ancient world?
Well, it's a combination of things really. I mean, first of all, you could say that they're very beautiful, they're very decorative. If you wanted to show that you'd spent a lot of money on your gravestone and the deceased was quite a wealthy person, then obviously it gives that impression because you know that someone has spent time on that picture. But also, you've got to think about this being in a public place where a lot of people couldn't necessarily read or write, and you might want to communicate something to those people as well. So you can get a certain message from the writing, but you can also get a message about the person from the picture as well.
So what you're saying is that people wouldn't necessarily need to be able to read to understand what the family of the deceased are trying to say about them?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you'll find that people could maybe read a little bit. If the name's at the top of the inscription or the name is the first word, they could maybe read the name of the person, but they're not going to bother with a long inscription. So the fact they can get the name and something from the picture is really helpful.
And that's an interesting point, because when we look at this gravestone, it's quite noticeable that the text takes up, what, 2/3 maybe of the gravestone, and then the picture takes up 1/3. But if we look at the example next to it, this one here, the picture is much, much bigger, and the inscription actually very small. Why is that?
Well, that could just be down to personal preference, really. We see a lot of variation in gravestones in the ancient world, and these are from around the same time. This one is a little bit later, maybe 50 years later. And this one is from Rome, whereas this one is from Athens. So there could just be different fashions in different areas. But also you've got to remember how these things were bought. You wouldn't normally commission your own picture. You would normally go to a shop where they had blank ones with no writing, but they already had the pictures. So you would choose a picture that you liked and then add the writing later.
What is represented here? What are we looking at?
So in this one we have a young woman, and she looks to be quite wealthy, of a citizen family probably, and we can see from her hair and her clothes that she is quite wealthy.
This is also shown by her musical instrument, which is a lyre, and the fact that she has a slave next to her, which is what the short figure represents.
You mentioned that she's a young woman. What is it that suggests she's a young woman?
Well, this is an assumption that I'm making actually, and I'm doing that using the combination of the words and the pictures, so that's quite interesting, because in the inscription we have her name here and her father's name over here. There's no mention of a husband.
But if she was married, it would have been her husband's name?
Probably it would have been her husband's name. Obviously she could be older. We often find actually in pictures on grave monuments that people are not always represented with a portrait of themselves. They could be a slightly different age to what you would think. You sometimes, with Roman examples, get a quite interesting thing where you have very young bodies and quite old faces. So the face is a better representation of their age than their body. We've got a reasonably young-looking face here, but also the information from the writing.
We've seen a couple of examples so far where the grave markers we've been looking at have pictures. Here we have an example that is just writing. Catherine, why is this one just writing, and what's it about?
Well, this is a container for keeping ashes in, and it belongs to Marcus Aurelius, so he's named after the emperor. He's not the emperor, he's a soldier, and I think he doesn't have a picture. You could say that it's a question of cost, that pictures would be more expensive and more elaborate, but actually it would be a reasonable cost to have a message written out that was this long. So cost isn't necessarily his main reason.
What's the message actually saying? What's it telling us about him?
Well, it's telling us quite a lot about him and his achievements. These are basically all about where he's from and then lists of his military achievements. So it tells us the cohort that he belonged to, the fact that he belonged to them for 14 years, and the fact that he died at the age of 45. So that's a big achievement for someone who's in the service of the army to reach an age like that.
So this is giving us quite a lot of specific information that maybe a picture wouldn't. A picture might give generalised themes, perhaps.
Yeah, so we do find grave markers with a picture of a soldier, and that's very common, or a picture of a particular type of soldier, like a standard bearer or a cavalry man on a horse. But the specific information about how much he's achieved, you could really only get that message through writing.